Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here with us. I know there's a lot going on, so we appreciate you being here, and we will appreciate your participation. So like Kyle said, there is a QR code. We would prefer this to be as interactive as possible, but because it does require you to scan that and type in questions, we'll go ahead and discuss a few things on this topic, and then we'll pause about halfway through, take some questions, and then we'll leave time at the end as well. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we're going to start with some brief introductions. Cam, you want to start us off?
Thanks for having us. Cameron Poole, Energy and Innovation Manager at Greater New Orleans, Inc. Regional Economic Development Organization for Southeast Louisiana. So we're tasked with Orleans Parish and the 10 parishes surrounding. A lot of the energy work I'll be talking about that we embarked on the last 2 years has really been statewide, and we've been really excited to do just that.
Thank you. And Matt?
Thanks, Jeanette. I'm Matt Candler. I moved to New Orleans in 2006. I had 3 day jobs and 1 night hobby. The day jobs were running an organization called New Schools for New Orleans, which helped rebuild schools after Hurricane Katrina. I was on the advisory board of the then president of Tulane, Scott Cowan's Institute on K-12 Public Ed, and I was the chair of the state association for charter schools, none of which has anything to do with energy. But my nighttime hobby of building electric motorcycles in my shed when my kids went to bed got me into the topic of the transition, electrification, and battery storage. I made my first angel investment in 2019 in a company called B2U Storage Solutions. We run the largest power plant in the US based solely on used electric car batteries. And ever since then, I've been serving as the GP, just a sole GP, in a very small fund called the Batteries Included Fund. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Matt. And Becky?
Hi everyone. Becky Shearman. I am a program director at the National Science Foundation in the relatively new Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships Directorate. My background is in biology. I am a former faculty member at a 4-year regional innovation ecosystem. Wow. 4-year regional higher ed institution in Massachusetts, and I have been overseeing much of the engines program. So you're all, I'm sure, familiar with fuel. So I've been a part of that program for quite some time now.
Thanks so much. So as you guys can tell, this is quite a unique panel, which is going to be cool because as we talk about fast-tracking emerging technologies in the energy space, we have an economic development perspective. We have, Matt, I'm just going to call you private sector. It sounds cool. All right, your private sector. And then Becky's representing, our federal partners that do fund a lot of this innovation. So I'm going to go ahead and start with some formal questions. And Becky, I'm going to toss it to you first, if you don't mind. Why don't you start? You already mentioned technology, innovation, and partnerships in your intro. And so if you guys hear us say the word TIP, that's the program she's talking about from the NSF. Talk to us about ways that TIP, tries to maximize what is happening either in research institutions where a lot of these technologies start or within other partner organizations from anywhere else.
Great. So if you're not familiar with the National Science Foundation, we are a federal agency. Most of the agency is really divided up by discipline, right? So there's a directorate that oversees investments in research in geology or biology, for example, right? A little over 2 years ago, a new directorate was stood up called the Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. That's really designed to scale innovations to what we refer to as to societal impact. So I thought, and this is the only thing I'm going to read, but I thought since TIP is kind of new and people are still trying to get to know us, I would read our mission statement so you can get a sense of what we're trying to accomplish. I need my glasses for this, though. Okay, so the TIP Directorate engages all Americans in accelerating critical and emerging technologies to advance U.S. competitiveness. The Directorate partners across sectors to advance 3 primary focus areas, all in these emerging tech areas. And that would be fostering or accelerating the technology advancement, right? So pretty in line with what the National Science Foundation does. Fostering innovation and economic growth, and preparing the American workforce for better quality, higher wage jobs. So we really are looking to not only advance the science, which is something that NSF has been in the business of doing for quite some time, but trying to find ways to accelerate how we can get those great innovations to impact into society. And we really are, sort of our fundamental thesis here is that that can only happen through partnerships. So whereas universities historically have been the prime recipient of NSF funds, they are still a core recipient of NSF funds, but we want to make sure other organizations are engaged in our community as well, whether that's through partnerships with universities or applying for funds directly.
Fantastic, thank you. And speaking of organizational partners, Cam, I'm going to give you this one. Can you describe for us how innovation ecosystems can be optimized to foster groundbreaking solutions in the energy sector?
Definitely.
That's a big one.
Yeah, so thankfully Jeanette shared this question beforehand, as big as it is, so I got to think about it a little bit. And I think there's a couple key things that are starting to characterize or be accepted as key traits of a strong ecosystem, especially as when we're talking about the unique needs of supporting energy and climate technologists. And what's really exciting is we're starting to see some new investments and programs come to the fold here in Louisiana that's really the stars aligning to make this happen here. And I think we're going to see a lot of impact from that. So the first one is academic and industry partnerships. That's starting with something that Louisiana has always led in. Our research institutions, the one we're sitting in now, LSU, and the several others that are part of the Future Use of Energy Louisiana NSF engine that Becky was just talking about, have really structured really close relationships with industry. That's making sure that foundational research, that is that first building block of the technologies that have characterized and will characterize the future of energy production, are being driven by those who are doing the thing, right? These companies. Now, there's a challenge there and something that's starting to be targeted, which is that engagement's been on either extreme side of the equation. Foundational research does have a tendency to stay in the lab, and if it's not in market, it's not being used, and that impact potential is not realized. Then on the other side, of course, industry does adapt new technologies, but aren't necessarily then involved in all of those intermediate steps where in this space you'll reach what's called these different valleys of death, right? Where either capital or some technology milestone in commercialization is not being reached, and then the concept still dies, whether it's left to lab or not. So this middle section is extremely important, and neither of which is less needed with industry and academic engagement. So what's really exciting is to see a historic level of NSF investment in the state to really build that out. Fuel is starting to drive these intermediate programs. It's not lost on me that tomorrow the application closes for the inaugural proof of concept fund, which is funding bridging that gap there for those early scientists and technologists that are really ready to take that step out of the lab. Bolstering and really giving the resources to industry and academia together to start doing more on the in-betweens and not just the extreme sides of this is going to bring a lot of really exciting and impactful ideas to light. So then moving forward, I think another key trait that we're starting to see built here, but will be essential in really catalyzing any actual accelerated technology development, is this lens towards hardware or deep tech. So Silicon Valley and New York, these coastal concentrations of startup activity and resources are really, characterized by SaaS, digital software, media, things that can be built on a computer and sold, interpersonally. Energy and climate technologies have technical and physical milestones that require a total different set of resources. When you're talking about new fuel production technologies, renewable resources being tested, that's not run on code and in a computer. So what are the resources that is giving startups and entrepreneurs the pilot space, that opportunity to show in a smaller scale how their technology works outside of the lab? That requires specialized capital that can work with the nuances of those types of projects being pre-commercial. That requires a total different type of industry buy-in outside of putting capital to it. That's about, my refinery is open to this pilot to you. My pipeline, I'll open up to be studied with this new coating that could make all this hydrogen and carbon management opportunities we're seeing come to the fold here technically feasible. The repurposing of our pipelines is only as valid as them actually being able to carry the molecules of the future. So segue into a really exciting partnership we have here at Geno Inc. and with Fuel and many others is with New Lab. They're originally based out of Brooklyn. They're an accelerator focused on this deep tech hardware suite of services, and they've expanded to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Detroit, and Uruguay since that, and they're targeting Louisiana as the energy platform of their program. And we've started with DOE Epic Prizes focused on bringing 9 startups to our state. They're doing exactly what I talked about. They're working with industry to unlock infrastructure, capital support, and partnership to reach next milestones. A very notable one is Mantle, high molten borate CCUS technology is partnering with Shell on a pilot project here in Louisiana. This is a Massachusetts-based company that would not have originally been growing here in Louisiana and bringing people here if it were not for that partnership. So we're seeing, again, really early stages of this model come to light, and I think that's going to be key. Sorry, I know I'm going long here, but I told you I'd book it all in the front. The last thing is also making sure your programs have like another lens beyond deep tech for energy, which is understanding the communities we're introducing this in. And we know that not only New Orleans, but the state of Louisiana is a diverse state. It's a predominantly black city. And we should start seeing not only employment in energy, but energy founders reflect that. And we're really excited through our H to the Future Award, which my colleague Salem up here is running these programs of, seeded a partnership with Opportunity Hub out of Atlanta. This is a startup accelerator specifically built to support underrepresented founders, BIPOC, female, Hispanic, and Indigenous in scaling and accelerating their climate and energy technologies. We've had 3 cohorts of this program, up to 90 founders supported, 15 finalists that have already received $375,000 in funding. And if you want to see what that's all about, we actually have our next cohort pitch competition for the next $100,000 in investments at the shop next Thursday at 6 p.m. But again, it's really important that we're also recognizing that programs can't just be built open to everyone, but also targeting those founders who are not characterizing the current startup mix right now, but have really impactful and scalable solutions for climate and energy.
Thank you. No, that was great. That you touched on a lot there. And when we got together as a panel on Zoom before, just to kind of meet each other and prepare for this topic specifically, we kind of really, I don't know, we gravitated towards a couple of big themes. Obviously, investment, everything takes money. Another one was workforce and economic impact, economic development impact, I should say. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Becky, I'm going to go back to you. Matt, I promise you're coming. On the investment and funding of emerging technologies, because that gets tricky between public and private sources of funding. So since you represent the public sector, when it comes to technology readiness levels, so if you hear us say TRLs, that's what we're talking about. When it comes to TRLs, where along this scale is the NSF really targeting or really, like, what is it thinking about in terms of its programs and its desire to maximize optimization of its funding programs?
So that's a great question. Historically, if you were to look at, I think, all of NSF's investments over the last 70 years, you'd probably see that probably down in like TRL 1 is where most of our dollars have been. In TIP, we are looking to expand that. I think this engines program and fuel is a really good example there that, 10 years, so these are awards that can go up to 10 years. At the end of 10 years, we want to see technology that's been supported through the engine go all the way up that TRL level. And the other component, so there's a couple different ways that we're thinking about this, right? There's the direct money that NSF is investing in programs like the engines program, or something like the Convergence Accelerator, which is another program that is really designed to kind of bring interdisciplinary teams together that can accelerate through early innovations to scale a technology, all to get you out of that TRL 1, 2 and into 3, 4. But we're also taking an ecosystem approach, right? So not that the structure of NSF or TIP really matters to any of you, but the division within TIP that I work in is referred to as the Innovation Ecosystems Division. So we recognize that as a science agency, we're not likely to make direct investments into something that is a TRL 8 or TRL 9. That may be something that you're finding through other federal agencies. But we are supporting the ecosystems that will have those initiatives, right? So I think a lot of what Cam already talked about and how an engine can be leveraged with investments that DOE is doing, that can be leveraged with investments that the state has already put in, can really help us accelerate up those TRLs. And so at TIP, we're looking for ways, even if we can't make the direct investments, we're looking for ways to help put our dollars where we can to kind of maybe one or two seats removed, still accelerate an ecosystem to advance those TRLs.
That's great, thank you. Matt, I'm gonna give a question to you and then we'll pause for questions from the audience. So hopefully someone has scanned the QR code and has some. So Matt, you've built several initiatives in varying functionalities that strive to make impact. So provide the audience with your thoughts about the role of private versus public funding, specifically within the energy sector, especially as the world begins to address issues that can be politically controversial and expensive, such as climate change.
Mm-hmm. It can be, is that right? It can be expensive, politically controversial? It
can, well, they can,
yes,
I would like,
no.
yeah, they can be
yes,
politically
so
controversial.
So I think the coconut game where you pick where the coconut moves around when you're at the basketball game, we're in the wrong seats. So if we were thinking about the TRL spectrum from 1 to 9, if you think about that in 3 categories from left to right, like if this is 1 to 3, this is Becky's seat. And I think fuel is such an amazing example of NSF finding a way to get public dollars into that super early stage. And it's really cool to get to see y'all's work on the ground here. I'm sitting in Cam's seat, and I think a lot of the work that he's doing with New Lab, which is one of the coolest incubating organizations on the planet. If you're in the Navy Yard in Brooklyn or if you're in Detroit, go see their facilities. Really inspiring. This is Cam's seat. He's sitting in that 4 to 6 space. And then as a very small investor who can't afford to put dollars in that far away from the market. So we've got technology starting on the left, going all the way to the market on the right. That's my chair over there. And I think when you're investing your own capital, you want to be able to leverage what other folks can do best. NSF is really going to always be much better at understanding the connection to science and how they can unlock. And I think hearing NSF talk about ecosystems is very inspiring. As someone who has spent a couple decades of his life here in New Orleans thinking about the ecosystem for our children, and in many ways we've sort of unbundled that ecosystem from a monolithic school system to one that's got many more moving parts. It's similar to how we are decentralizing energy. We don't need to decentralize all of it, but there are some technologies that make more sense to decentralize and to distribute. And so I think if you think about public-private capital, I think this middle seat on the capital front is the scariest one. There's a lot of private return-seeking investment that's over here near the end of the story where we've seen the technology risk go away, we've seen the market risk and the production costs risk go away, and we now have a product that's ready for consumers, and we have people in this middle that have already bought it, maybe at a premium. But if we can get the technology to seat 3, there's a lot of private capital there. There are public markets, there's private investors, there's venture, there's increasingly family offices. And I think over here we've got some room, at least in Louisiana, we got a lot of money to work with. It's here in the middle, this scary middle where there are multiple valleys of death that's really scary. I'm working on an initiative that I'm calling a syndicate of small family offices that have pretty much the freedom to invest wherever they want along this cycle and see if we can't find investments for family offices in this middle chair. So can we bring private capital that's not necessarily obligated to a venture capital stack of limited partners or a general partner that has said this, I'm going to only focus on hockey stick shaped software business models. I'm patient. I'm willing to build. And for example, if Cam's trying to establish markets here in Louisiana, my family lives in Louisiana, I'd love for my capital to be close to what he's doing. And so I think that, if you look at how capital overlays, I think this is the weak spot here in the middle. And I think that also is the place where we see the most excitement, especially with something like fuel or even what Cam's doing with New Lab.
I'm going to build off of what Matt said there a bit too that I missed when I was running through that, which is when you're talking about scale and what you want to be by as a startup or venture that's introducing a new technology or energy resource, that proximity to industry and the point of impact that figuring out these tough challenges and paths forward here in Louisiana means for the world is so real. And so when we were saying earlier that a lot of historic concentration and activity with startups has not only been sector-wise, digital, software, SaaS, and that the revolution to come, I've heard what's to come here for energy framed as the next technology arms race. Don't know if I love that fully, but I like what it captures, which is that there's a globally competitive ecosystem for these economies and these countries, these states even, to be the home for where these new solutions and technologies come from. This is a fair, if not unfair, advantage that Louisiana has in the playing field to become a global hub and destination for these problem solvers, for these solutions that really ultimately are what technologies and startups are, right? An entrepreneur is someone who thinks they have the right idea to solve a problem, and right now a lot of those are the problems associated with the future of energy, unprecedented load growth, demand, and decarbonization along it. So what's been really impactful is seeing that, not just startups seeing like, oh, I ought to be close to my customer base here, right? Whether that represents industry, coastal and climate solutions or the like, but also starting to hear from funds as well that we ought to restructure where we're focusing. These companies aren't all going to come up from the East and West Coast as they maybe had or maybe flocked to us too, relevant to where we were in Silicon Valley and New York. And I think this really does represent a very exciting moment for our ecosystem here to capture that.
Excellent, thank you. Kyle, do we have any questions?
Yep, we got about 4 questions so far. The first one kind of goes with the innovative startups. The question was, what help can you provide for innovative startups to grow their business? Are there partnerships providing both capital and or other aids, including facilities, instruments, and personnel, to help startups with limited resources to help scale and commercialize the process?
I'm going to add to that if you guys want to answer it, but I would, just based on my experience building the venture fund at the Innovation Institute and other things, can you also fit in, talk to us about how these startups get in with potential industry partners? Because the data and the pilots and the efficacy is what people are betting on when they make those investments. So I don't know who wants to take it first.
Can I do a 4.0 thing first, and then you do
Perfect.
Why are y'all looking at me?
There you go. So from 2010 to 2020, I ran a non-dilutive incubator based here in New Orleans that eventually went national called 4.0. And we were really trying to, we sucked at finding innovators, founders of new companies that weren't white and male. And one of the biggest pivot that we made was realizing that, you know, in the lexicon of what makes a great founder, typically from the coast, the West Coast in particular, it's do you have the capacity to quit your job and be the tough guy who's going to go start a company? And we made a simple decision to invest in people before they quit their jobs. And that started a process that radically transformed the portfolio at 4.0, which right now is more than 60% female, more than 60% women, and more than 60% people of color as they represent, as they identify themselves. And I think understanding that, that original sort of metric of like, do you have the guts to show us that you can quit your job is so soaked in privilege and is so much a language that comes from the investor, not from the person who might be most proximate to the problem and who might have an idea but not the means to explore it. And so I think to the extent that we can move our starting point further back and then spread our dollars further, every time you move that order of magnitude check size, if I have $100,000, for me at 4.0, our decision was we would rather write $100,000 checks, which is what we did. We wrote more than 1,500 sub-$1,000 checks. And entrepreneurs all over the country, they now serve more than 10 million families around the U.S. and have launched more than 300 companies. And so, you know, I think thinking about how do you use not just your financial capital to spread that funnel wide and move it upstream, that can be really powerful. And that's why I think both of my partners on the panel here, that only works if you have an ecosystem to wrap around those folks, because you need more than capital, but often it's that capital that sort of sets the tone and runs the most people off. So if you can fix the capital's, I think, overload of power in the relationship and get them out of the conversation first, then the ecosystem work that Cam and that Becky are trying to do in the earlier stages can really unlock really cool creativity.
Yeah, I mean, everything Matt said there, which really translates to, for the startup, especially even when you're meeting them where they're at, everything counts, capital costs, but so does time, so does all of those other resources I was alluding to as being essential to the type of technology commercialization pathway that energy technologists face. And so that whole list that was listed in the question relates to a need that can be undercut in cost with the right support from the ecosystem. So when I liked the one on like instruments and tools, actually. Before this work, I was at the Bioinnovation Center on Canal Street, taking a much different sector approach on the same work relevant to starting startups here for bioinnovation. And there they have a shared lab. That's the baseline equipment that any biotechnologist would need. So in their own lab that they were paying for, costs, right? They could focus their purchases on the specialized equipment relevant to their brain-on-a-chip technology or that full spectrum that really lived in that facility there. So it's been interesting to sort of take a similar lens of those core needs relevant to energy and startup technologists and university assets. So a lot of these research institutions across the state also have already invested in very costly specialized equipment. And it's no surprise that in Louisiana, a lot of that specialized equipment is tooled towards energy or hardware. Not lost on us, right, that we have the manufacturing assembly facility in NASA just 30 minutes away with some of the most specialized equipment for aerospace, but also our universities shouldn't be slept on. So something we've been doing is trying to map out what are at these institutions, what is available for fee for service, what's maybe undercutting those fees relevant to partnering at a human capital development level with PIs, researchers, professors, even PhDs and grad students at these universities to partner with them on how those labs are used, but make those models of lab use more accommodated towards startup use. So circling back again to the 9 companies we're working with through the DOE award with New Lab, it's no surprise that many of them have started talking to LSU, ULL, UNO, and the like to start structuring those research partnerships and lab use. Why would they, in their aspirations to build and build here, be redundant in specialized equipment? So that's a very niche thing that again shows if the ecosystem, if the unprecedented university collaboration that's been born through Fuel and NSF could also start bearing fruit towards more complex things like that really don't relate to financial capital, venture and risk capital, but just other costs for a startup that do add up over time. It's again an exciting moment and an opportunity to again look at all those quote unquote little things that can really be leveraged to ease the burden of startups and then again advertise that this is the ecosystem to be in if you're trying to develop that energy technology. The industry one I want to touch on again real quick too, because it is tough and it's been touched upon a couple panels today on, where industry's been successful in things like workforce development partnerships, and there's risks there. And there's a high degree of variance in how big corporations and energy producers approach adapting technologies. So that Mantle partnership with Shell in our cohort was funded directly by Shell's venture fund. So it showed an organization like Shell had both their own risk and seed capital to put behind this effort in the pilot project, but they also, again, had what's quite frankly a lot more valuable, a refinery to demonstrate this technology on. That's physical, that's built, it's fixed, and it's a lot harder to get that agreement out of. So that company had both. That's great. Shell's got a robust approach to this. There's many other companies that are similarly open to exploring what they do have. They own and possess infrastructure, they're running facilities, but they don't have a venture fund. Corporate-led venture funds internally are a lot more harder to come by than, hey, I have assets to manage and I'm open to learning how opening up some of this and partnering with you on this will get me closer to using your technology at scale to achieve whatever target that is, whether that's decarbonization or scaling into an entire new sector like the way majors are exploring offshore wind. So I think industry partnerships is something, again, that's very unique to what Louisiana can offer to energy and climate startups, because we have so much of that here. We have not just those facilities, but those people here who are being tasked interorganizationally in figuring out what these plants will look like in the future.
That's great, thank you. And I would be terrible at my job if I didn't call you out for leaving Tulane University School of Science and Engineering out of your list. We have plenty of instrumentation facilities that we do rent to the public, and including clean rooms. So, next question, Kyle.
You're not even going to let me counter
That was our commercial break for the day. No.
Yeah. Shout out Dr. Smith. You've been great for the Offshore Wind Tech Hub.
So Kyle, do we have another question?
Yep. Next question is, what key metrics should innovation ecosystems be tracking to inform ecosystem development? What do you see as credible evidence for success?
I'm kind of curious to hear from Becky, because when it comes to federal funding, there's a lot of compliance and KPIs and tracking and metrics to be reported. So please tell us.
Great. So that is the million-dollar question. And I will say, we've been talking to place-based innovation ecosystem experts and researchers and academics and practitioners, asking them the very same question, right? What are the things you want to see early on to indicate success? What are the metrics? I have to be a little careful here right now, because I'm wearing, I am already a part of the NSF Engines program. But I think there's a difference by kind of looking at what are the characteristics, and then what are the the individual metrics, and certainly what are the targets for those metrics. But from in all the conversations I've had with all of the experts I've talked to, the network of partners seems to be at the center of what it looks like to be successful. And again, I'm not speaking on behalf of NSF Engines program. I'm looking at the CEO of Fuel right now. But really, you will talk to people who will say, well, innovation ecosystem is only going to be successful if it's the size of a metropolitan area. Any bigger than that, and you're not going to be able to have an impact. Or it has to be co-located where you've got elite universities to really drive the R&D. And all of those things may help. I think a lot of federal agencies are betting on the fact that you don't need to only have this in places with the most elite universities limited to metropolitan areas. We want to see this propagate across the country wherever you have the interest and the alignment of diverse stakeholders present. So the thing that keeps coming to the top is really around those partnerships, right? True trusted partnerships within that ecosystem, so that there's an aligned vision, right? So that the universities who are participating, the economic development offices that are participating, the capital investors, they all understand what the larger goal is. They see themselves in it and are therefore willing to step in and say, yeah, I'll contribute. And then that includes the communities, right? We don't want to forget the people who are living within this ecosystem. They have to be bought in as well. And so that, whatever the metrics are around the strong network of partners, I think is one of the most valuable things. And again, saying that as someone who's been talking to a lot of experts in the area, and not as someone who may be involved in assessing the status of any given awardee at NSF.
Okay, does anyone else want to comment? No? Okay, Kyle, let's get to the next question, because I really want to make sure the audience gets heard.
What recent energy startup do you believe in the most, and why?
It's going to be one of you guys. guys.
I'm not in the business of assessing startups anymore, so I don't know. Matt, that might be you.
Just since the fund is called Batteries Included Fund, I'll tell you a story about a company that has a battery in it, which I think is cool. So the investing thesis at the fund is, where can we put a battery in an interesting place that adds value to humans as we electrify the economy? We don't need to electrify everything, but there's a lot of stuff that we can electrify now, and increasingly, as we understand doing work with energy that is coming at us through electrons versus molecules, there's a lot of distinctions there. I don't know if you know Azim Azar's work. He wrote a book called The Exponential Age. He just wrote a piece in the Financial Times recently, which he referred to as riffing off of Mark Andreessen, why energy tech is eating the world. And he makes a distinction in that piece that traditional carbon-based fuels act like, and we treat them like commodities. We get them out of the ground, we process them and move them, we consume them, repeat. The difference between that and renewables, but more specifically, renewable sources that can then be electrified and then do work for us in machines that either use electromagnets or electrochemical storage. Thermal storage has some of these similar properties as well. These particular sources of energy act, walk, and talk a lot more like traditional technologies. We've got, and they, if you see traditionally, for the most part, coal has stayed flat, gas and petroleum over the decades. We haven't seen Moore's law apply at least on the consumer, the adoption end. Certainly some of the technologies we use in the processes, the extraction, for sure. Moore's law is alive and well. Swanson's law, which applies to solar panel cells and many other production manufacturing processes, for every doubling of capacity, we see 20% cost reductions. So one really interesting feature of renewables and batteries, who are also on that similar exponential cost curve, is that you can see them starting to add value a lot quicker. As humans, we kind of suck at exponential curves. We just aren't really wired as a species to understand what geometric versus arithmetic curves do. We consistently underestimate them. And so I find that utterly fascinating. And so I'm constantly looking for places where a battery can start to unleash that exponential value creation for humans. Here's my favorite story right now. That was a really long-winded intro to copper. There's a company called Copper. It was originally called Channing Copper, but they build a 30-inch wide induction stove that has a 3 kilowatt-hour lithium iron phosphate battery built in. It also has an inverter on board, and so there's some 110 outlets. There's a million reasons why I love this company. Number one, these are technologies that we already know. Induction's been around for a long time. LFP has been around a long time. Both have been walked down the cost curve, and we're able to get tremendous scale and value out of that. There's no TRL risk to induction coils or to LFP batteries. The inverters in board are all relatively straightforward. And here's another really cool thing. Induction does not cause asthma. It does not cause cancer. What's the smallest battery you can put in your house and still get that 30% IRA credit? 3 kilowatt hours. So you're getting 30% storage credit. It's a battery to the grid. Of course, you can then participate in virtual power plant economics and make money with your appliance by helping the grid. And then finally, for me, a middle school math teacher at heart, if we think about who can traditionally, we talked about workforce, and I'm so glad that that's on y'all's list as well, but we think about who can typically install a traditional 240-volt induction stove. You need an 8,000-hour journeyman electrician to pull that 240 from the breaker box to the kitchen. But guess what? This one plugs into 110. Because when I'm cooking, I'm taking half my power out of the battery and half out of the wall. And I can still get the performance of a full-fledged 240-volt induction stove. Then when the power goes out, my fridge is already plugged into the stove, and I'm getting through without sacrificing what's in the fridge. I can also plug in my Wi-Fi router and a fan, and that 3 kilowatt hour battery can get most families through the night. But again, my inner educator, guess who gets to install that and make a living? An apprentice on day 3 of their work in a number of different trades, whether they're plumbers, HVAC, or electrical contractors. And so this is a great example to me of when you put a battery in an interesting place, it unlocks value for the humans that get to have it in their lives. And as an investor, there is nothing more exciting when you find someone who jams with you on those things and is building the product for the human who gets to leverage those, the optionality and the cost benefits of this emerging tech.
Well, now I'm curious and I want to buy one. So I'm just curious. I am curious about this. Is this a U.S. company?
Yes,
Copper is
U.S. company based out of the Bay Area.
Okay.
They just got approved to put 10,000 of these in New York. They have been selling stoves in California, and you can now pre-order one in Louisiana.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And you said 10,000 in New York. Was that like a public contract?
Yes, exactly. They're trying to rapidly decarbonize multifamily housing.
Beautiful.
And again, think about that too, right? Like if you have a 100-unit house, that's let's call it a 1,000-unit complex because the math is hard, right? There's 3 megawatt hours of storage. Boom.
Fantastic. That's a great story.
It's a fun one. That's a really, really fun company.
Good question. Kyle, do we have another one?
I think we're out of time for questions.
Oh, darn.
Dang it.
All right. Our clock says we had 3 minutes, but okay. All right. I'm just going to ask one more question just to kind of wrap it up. We didn't get into the workforce thing that we all got very passionate about because that's real impact too. But I do want to ask about policy because, as we talk about any technologies, especially early on in the TRL scale, expense adoption is prohibited usually because of expense. And if you have an alternative that you're used to and it's affordable, like why would you be an early adopter if you don't even have the choice financially? So talk to us about policy and how we can use that. Cam, since you represent a regional economic development organization, you guys touch local, you touch regional, and you work with the state and the feds. What have you seen or what do you want to say about how policy can help us achieve these adaptations of new technologies?
Well, I would say in the light of the upcoming transition federally, and that's been a topic du jour, quite frankly, I would use that to spin that state has never been more important, and for, especially in specific to all these things we're talking about, relevant to industrial and commercial scale adoption, and then also this work we're doing here. So sort of a call to action to say, let's keep working with our state as we have been, because there's a lot of great work there. I believe a great colleague of mine, Josh Flagg, the new and first Chief Innovation Officer of Louisiana Economic Development, captures a bit of that, as well as the state partnering with the Energy Office more formally with economic development to do a lot of this great work ahead. I would say one specific thing, looking at the clock there, is circling back to New Lab, a policy specific to a shared Venn diagram item of big commercial adoption and those pilot projects I was talking about is permitting. They've done a great job working with us to start laying out how we can accelerate those pilot permitting timelines so it's not 2 years to validate your technology, but 2 weeks, which is immense as it relates to further adoption, and that's achievable. It's been done in other states. We're looking forward to seeing how that looks here.
Fantastic. All right. Are there any closing remarks? We literally have 1 minute on the dot. And if there are not, I just want to thank all of you again for being here. I hope this was interesting and got everyone thinking, and hopefully you have our contact information in the program. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of the forum.